Okay, AP Art History, it is time to learn more about these elements and principles of art. You were assigned a summer assignment to get to know the initial terms of these words and see if you can apply some of their meanings to some of our 250 images. But now it's time to review and expand our understanding of these terms. Before we start getting into the actual elements and principles themselves, a term that I really need all of you to understand, because we will be using it quite a bit, almost in daily conversation when talking about artwork, but also it's a big part of how the elements and principles are kind of composed in a piece of artwork. But you need to understand the term composition. Okay? Composition refers to the overall arrangement and placement of the elements, the principles, and the subject matter on the artist's blank space. So a blank space meaning a blank canvas, a blank piece of paper, a blank wall for a fresco, an empty physical space that a sculpture is going to take up, or a plot of land that a skyscraper is going to be designed and built on. I mean, whatever that blank space is, the artist is the one that is creatively in charge of how they're going to arrange their subject matter. And there are just, really endless ways to do this, but there are also some kind of tried and true and traditional ways to kind of compose your piece of artwork. So here is just a little diagram of 6 kind of traditional ways to put a composition together. We have our rule of thirds, where it's broken up into areas. You have triangular compositions. These triangular compositions are also called formal compositions, which we will see a lot of when we get into kind of Renaissance art. And we have L shapes, we have S shapes, you have ovals, diagonals, and this is, again, the bulk of the subject matter, the bulk of the elements and principles, will kind of be structured in these, arrangements and shapes. Okay, so I really needed you to understand this term first. All right, so now let's get into the elements and principle. And basically, we need to know, what is the difference? You can hear me talk about elements and principles, but what I need you to understand more is how they are different and why they're 2 separate categories. So I like to kind of use the metaphor and compare it to cooking. So the elements of art are basically the ingredients. These are the things that you need in order to make a work of art. Or metaphorically speaking, these are the items that you need in order to make a certain meal, right? So if you're wanting to make lasagna, you're going to buy lasagna noodles, tomato sauce, ricotta cheese, mozzarella cheese. See, all those ingredients are also the elements of art, okay? The elements of art are line, shape, form, value, color, texture, and space. Okay? Then the principles of art, or oftentimes they're referred to as the principles of design. Either way, they mean the same thing. But the principles are actually the recipe for how the meal is made, for what do you do with all of these ingredients. So again, if you're making lasagna, you're going to take your pasta, your tomato sauce, your beef and your ricotta, right? All those things. And then you're going to follow a recipe. You're going to boil the noodles, right? Then you're going to layer the noodles and put down a layer of ricotta and then more noodles on top and then tomato sauce and sprinkle mozzarella and then repeat. Okay, so the principles of art basically tells you how the artist took the elements and used them, how they prepared the work of art with the elements. So that is the difference between them. So starting with the elements of art, I feel like these are pretty straightforward. They are easy to see, they're easy to recognize. They either kind of exist in the structure of artwork or not. So starting with line. Definition for line is that it is a mark that has a starting point but does not meet nor come back to the starting point. Okay, the lines do not basically, come full circle. A line can be infinite. A line can show direction. It could be vertical, horizontal, diagonal, so it can show direction. Lines can also convey emotions. They can be symbolic. Think about our alphabet. Our alphabet is made up of a bunch of lines, okay? But they represent things. Line is also known for having lots of variety to them. Variety can come from thickness, curves, whether it's straight, zigzag, long, short, and the placement, again, diagonal, vertical. So line variety is kind of endless, but the point of a line is that it never comes back to its starting point. And I've given you some examples of line here. I mean, here we have line that, is very bold, shows emotion, shows direction. Here we have line that represents symbol, specifically here the Arabic alphabet. Here we have lines that show direction and of your vertical and your horizontal, and that they make up a structure. Here we have lines that, we have curved, we have straight, diagonal, right? But then when you put these lines together, or you place these lines in your composition very purposefully, then these lines become symbols for things. They become edges, they become outlines, they become things that we can then recognize. The next element is shape. So when you take that line and you have your starting point and you bring the end of the line back to the starting point, well, now you don't have a line anymore. Now you have a shape. So a shape is made when a line intercepts or connects at its starting point, and then it surrounds or encloses a space. Okay? A shape, though, has to be flat. It has to be two-dimensional in order for it to be a shape. I mean, it can have height, it can have width, but it cannot have depth. Usually, when we talk about shapes, we classify them as either being more geometric in nature or more organic in nature. And simply that means geometric are shapes that have names. Triangle, circle, oval, square. They're man-made shapes that have a certain set of rules and can be repeated over and over again, okay? They have names. Organic shapes is pretty much everything else. It has, no specific structure to it. It can be free form. They're usually derived from nature. And so when we talk about shape, we usually classify them as one or the other or closer to one or the other. Okay, so again, I've tried to give you some examples of artwork with shape. This Mondrian painting over here in the corner is very straightforward. I mean, we're looking at squares and rectangles. They have, all different hues, but, it's a composition of shape. Here we have a painting that is very, very flat. And looking at just, the hat of the emperor here, you can see that really that is a flat black shape, okay? And even though we recognize the green area, as this person's body, as this person's kind of cloak, um, we also can recognize that is just a basic flat shape. And yeah, there may be some distinguishing lines inside of it that give off a little bit more detail, but overall it's a basic shape. Here you have outlines, outlines that have, come together to capture a space, an enclosed space. And it just so happens that, again, when you repeat it over and over again, they become recognizable shapes, and we can recognize these as being the states. Form, on the other hand, is kind of the opposite of a shape in the sense that form now has to be three-dimensional. Form has to have height, it has to have width, but it also has to have depth. So that means that it has to take up physical, actual space. Something that, you can measure a depth from front to back, and that oftentimes you can completely walk around and circumambulate around the entire structure. And that is basically the criteria for form. Form cannot exist in any sort of flat work. So paintings and drawings, prints, things like that are excluded. Form cannot exist in those artworks. Value. So value refers to the lightness and the darkness of the artwork. But this is not an either-or thing. It includes the entire grayscale in between. It's like it's a spectrum from the darkest to the lightest. And when I say grayscale, that is an art term. It doesn't necessarily mean the color gray, but a grayscale means that it's kind of showing that spectrum, almost that like ombre effect from very, very dark to medium to light to very, very light. And so up here at the top, I've given you two examples of some grayscales. I've given you, a black and white grayscale where at the bottom you have, pure spots of black. At the top you have pure spots of white. And in between you have all the different shades of gray you can get. But it's important to know that value, although very easy to recognize in, a black and white hued artwork, that value does not just exist in black and white. That value also exists in color. And so this is an example of color that has value. And, contrary to what people may think when looking at this, it's not like you start at the darkest and then you get lighter and lighter, okay, or vice versa. Really what this is representing is the middle tone is what the actual hue is. Hue is another term for color. We will use the term hue more often than color, okay? So the actual hue is what is here in the middle. And then the value goes dark to light. And what's important to know is that when you go lighter, that is called a tint. A tint is created when your hue gets white added to it. And then it gets lighter and lighter and lighter all the way until it just becomes white. Okay? The opposite, when your hue is darker, that is called a shade. And the way to create a shade is by adding black to a hue. So you start with a hue and you slowly start to add that black until it keeps getting darker and darker and darker until you get all the way to black. Okay? That is value. And I tried to show you some examples here of value where we have some lovely soft shades of blacks to grays to whites, but then even with some of the red, you can have some value changes in the red where you have some deep dark reds, but then it kind of fades into this like peachy pink because it's so pale and so light. But value is also how um, artists capture any sense of um, realism to their artwork or kind of photorealism. Um, when you're trying to create things that have depth and look very realistic and very contoured, you need value to do that. You cannot do it without value. So, for example, if you look at all of the drapery in her dress, this effect that we can look at and understand and recognize as big, deep folds in drapery, this effect cannot be achieved without value changes within the green. And so if you look at this green and you look very closely, you can see that there's very, very, very light greens. Those are the highlights. There's your middle tone greens, and then there's dark, deep greens that show the darkest values possible, the darkest shades possible. If you look back here in this corner, some of those creases almost look pure black because it's such a deep shade of that green that it almost appears to be black. So all of that detail is created by the use of value. Texture. Texture comes in two forms when talking about artwork. Tactile texture is very straightforward. It refers to the actual texture that can be felt with your hands. So you touch it and you can feel it, okay? Not just see it. And so this is an example down here. We know that if we were to touch this sculpture, that we would be able to feel this kind of stone, grainy, type of texture on this person's back. The other is what's called visual texture. Sometimes it's referred to as implied texture. Okay, this visual or implied texture is texture that has been revealed in a two-dimensional application. Okay, so we know that if we touch it, if we put our hands on the painting, it's going to feel flat and it's going to feel smooth. But visually, we can see that there are illusions of texture. And unfortunately, I tried to blow up um, kind of a detail image here and it didn't work out very well. But if we were to look at this painting closely, it's so full of texture. From the bird's nest right here, it looks, like it's full of straw and hay and everything, to the grapes, to all the leaves that are intertwined. There's just a lot of texture going on here. And our eyes can see it and we can interpret it, but at the same time, we also know that to the touch, it is smooth. Okay, space has multiple references to it. Um, the way that we refer to space in the first sense is called positive and negative space. Okay, all that does is it identifies the part of the artwork that is usually the subject matter, and then the negative space is kind of like the empty space around it, or the part of the artwork that is kind of left over, or the unnecessary, unimportant background. Okay. Artists are quite typically concerned and pay attention to both. So both positive and negative space, an artist wants them both to be extremely interesting shapes. And when you have a strong positive space and a strong negative space together, they can wind up making a very strong piece of artwork. So a couple of examples up here in this right-hand corner, we have a lot of recognizable shapes here that are, silhouettes of animals and, some TP shapes, a few human shapes, right? But that's the positive space because that's the subject matter. That's what the artist drew or put put there, okay? And all the white that is around those shapes, so the area that has been kind of untouched, that is the negative space, okay? The same with three-dimensional work. Three-dimensional work has positive and negative. So for this sculpture here, all the positive space is, the actual metal sculpture itself. So we have the dancing Shiva in the middle, and we have the ring of fire around Shiva, and that's the positive space. But the negative space is not only, all the empty space that is existing around the artwork, but all of the empty space that is existing through the artwork as well, through the sculpture, okay? And when you really focus on that negative space and what that shape is, because it's enclosed by the positive space, those empty spaces, the negative space, is actually very interesting. Okay, the next type of space is about perspective, okay? And perspective is a way to create an illusion of depth. And they do this by kind of a mathematical means, by having a vanishing point and, working your lines in the artwork that all kind of angle towards the same vanishing point. Perspective is used a lot when you are creating artwork that has some sort of like architectural element in it, okay? I don't mean architecture itself, all right? I don't mean buildings and structures itself. I mean a painting of a room or a drawing of a church. I mean actual two-dimensional reproductions of architecture. And typically that's where a lot of perspective comes in. So I gave this example over here to show perspective because we're looking at a background here, a room that has a lot of architecture in it. And if we kind of drew some lines in terms of perspective, all of your architectural lines they actually come together to meet right here in this middle vanishing point from the foreground of the steps, okay, to the top of the columns back here. They all line up to one single vanishing point in the background, and that gives an illusion of depth and space. The last way to work with space in an artwork, and also to give this illusion of depth, is to work in layers called a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. Okay, and so that basically means when you're looking at artwork that there's going to be subject matter that looks very, very close to you, and it looks like it's the first thing on this paper or canvas, and that is called the foreground. It's usually the largest, and it's usually the most detailed and the most crisp, okay? And then when you look behind that, you can see, some middle ground. So you can see that, there's something behind that foreground, okay? A little bit more subject matter, a little bit more information. It may not be as detailed because it's supposed to be farther away, right? And when things are farther away, you can't pick up on detail as much. But then if you go one more layer back, you can see way off in the distance, something exists out there, and that's called the background, okay? And the background is supposed to be, very kind of hazy and atmospheric because again, the farther away it is, the less detailed it is. So these three layers of background, middle ground, and foreground can give the illusion that that two-dimensional artwork has extreme depth. Okay, color. Color is a big one only because there's a lot of vocabulary terms that go with it. So first and foremost, we never really talk about color as color, okay? I know it's going to take some practice, but I'm telling you up front that when we talk about artwork, we don't ever really want to say, it has color. That is extremely vague, and that is not how we talk about color, okay? Artwork doesn't have color or not. There are categories of color, and that is what we want to pinpoint when describing and looking at artwork, okay? So color is organized and structured by what's called the color wheel. And I put a color wheel up here for you to reference, but without getting too much into it, this is the order of, how color is organized. And the order can never be changed. You can take this wheel and you can spin it. Red could be on the bottom and green can be on the top, but you can never change the order of how the colors lie on the wheel, okay? Red orange always has to be next to red, and red orange always has to be in between orange and red. I mean, that order can never change, okay? So what I need you to know for this class and for analyzing artwork are basically these terms that fall under the category of color. Okay? So the first one, primary. Primary are the colors red, blue, and yellow. They are called primary because those are the three hues that make every other hue that we have. Okay? Now, notice the colors black and white are not on the color wheel. That is on purpose. It is because white represents white light, which represents the entire spectrum of colors. Okay? Black, technically, represents the absence of color. So, in reality, black and white are not hues at all. They represent the full spectrum of color or the opposite, which is the absence of color. Okay? Now, we use them as hues, and we use them very strategically in art. But in terms of science and color science, they are not actually hues. Okay? So red, blue, and yellow are completely responsible for making every other hue that you know and can see. The secondary colors are green, orange, and violet. And those are the hues that are directly made from the primary colors, okay? The tertiary colors, which are also sometimes called intermediate colors, okay? So if you hear either term, it means the same thing. Tertiary colors are all the colors you see on the color wheel that are hyphenated, like blue-green and, red-violet, okay? But the tertiary colors come from when you have one primary color and one secondary color and you mix them, okay? So that's kind of how the color wheel itself is broken down. Once you understand the color wheel and how it's broken down, then there's things called color families. And it's just represents groupings of colors within the color wheel, right? So the first one I need you to know is called monochromatic. Monochromatic means one hue, mono meaning one hue, but plus all the values of that hue. So this kind of goes back to value. It's when you create a piece of artwork and you're only using one hue, but yet you can use the entire spectrum of its tints and its shades. Okay, that's monochromatic. Analogous. Analogous is a family of any three hues, but the hues have to live right next door to each other. So what that means is three neighbors. So an analogous color family could be yellow-orange, yellow, and yellow-green. If an artist uses these three colors dominantly in a piece of artwork, then they may have an analogous color scheme, okay? Or green, blue-green, blue. This is analogous. Claude Monet was well known for using analogous color schemes in his paintings. The next family, which is a big one, is complementary. Complementary actually is just about using two hues, but they have to be extreme opposites on the color wheel. So blue-green all the way across to red-orange, okay? Violet and yellow. So if the artist is dominantly using these two colors, okay, opposite on the color wheel, then you're using a complementary color scheme. This is one of the strongest and boldest color schemes you can choose because they are the most opposite of colors, they're the most contrasting of colors, they are the boldest of colors when you use them together and when you use them in isolation together. Okay? Neutrals. Neutrals represent the hues that you don't see here. They represent all the grays and the browns. Okay? Grays and browns, they come from all of these colors, okay? All of the hues here, when you mix them strategically, will get you your browns. When you mix complementary colors together, mix them. That is how you get browns. It makes sense. That's how you get a neutral, because you are using extreme opposites on the color wheel. When you mix extreme opposites together, they cancel each other out. And therefore, we get a neutral. And the neutrals are your brown families. Browns, tans, chocolates, all that. Okay. The last one is warm and cool families. Okay. Warm and cool splits the color wheel in half. Okay. The cool colors are the greens, the blues, the violets. The warm colors are the oranges, the reds, the yellows. All right, so we covered the elements. Now we're going to talk about the principles of design. They're a little bit more challenging to recognize. It takes practice. That's all that's to it. The reason is because they can range from very subtle to very dominant and obvious. They can exist in isolation, but you can also have, 4 or 5 principles of design existing at the same time. It just, again, takes practice to be able to recognize the principles within a piece of artwork. Okay, so starting with balance. Balance refers to the visual weight of an artwork. So when you are looking at artwork and asking yourself if you feel a sense of balance, or if you feel like kind of the weight of the artwork is being shifted from one area to another, okay? But we talk about balance in 3 different ways. The first is symmetrical balance. Symmetrical means that it is equally balanced on either the left or the right or the top or the bottom of the artwork, and usually can be referred to as like a mirror image from one side to the other. Okay, that's not always, you're not always going to get a mirror image in order for it to be symmetrical, but sometimes the mirror image does happen. So this right here is an example of symmetrical. If I split this artwork right down the middle, what is happening on the left is pretty much exactly what's happening on the right. That's not a mirror image. I mean, we're looking at totally different people here on the left and the right, okay? But what we have here are the same shapes, right? The same sizes, the same composition. Remember, the same arrangement of the objects, and it doesn't stray at all. The next is an asymmetrical, okay? That is when you have two sides that are kind of dissimilar. And they have like kind of opposite visual weight, but at the same time, even though they're opposite visual weight, they have still come together to bring a sense of balance. So this Starry Night over here is a good example of asymmetrical balance. And a lot of it is because you have this large black cypress tree, over here on the left-hand side, right? And you can feel visual weight from that. But when we look at the painting as a whole, we don't feel like it's totally unbalanced. We don't feel like everything is over here on the left. And that's because Van Gogh has balanced it by putting multiple smaller subject matters on this side, along with a very brightly contrasted yellow circular moon. Okay, so what he has done is taken a bunch of small things and something with a brighter color and use that to balance out this big, bold, black shape of a cypress tree. Okay, so it's asymmetrical, but yet it still brings balance to the overall visual weight. And then the last type of balance is called radial. Radial balance is when the artwork is equal all the way around and that it actually radiates from a center point. So I've included a couple examples. This bark cloth here is an example of radial balance because we kind of have this center point and the rest of the elements and principles that make up this design all radiate out from the center. Okay, the same with this temple. We have, if you looked at it from an aerial perspective, we have a center point and all of the structure around it radiates from it. Okay, contrast. Contrast refers to the opposites of the elements, extreme opposites of the elements. It's important to understand that contrast is a spectrum. So it's not like you either have it or don't. The way that we talk about contrast is either high or low. And so either artwork has high contrast, which means it's extremely opposite, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, artwork has very low contrast, meaning that the differences are very, very subtle. And the artwork is almost on kind of like this even keel, okay? And contrast can refer to any given element. So contrast can refer to color. You can have color contrast. Remember I said to you, the most contrasting colors are complementary colors. So if you have a painting that is a complementary color scheme, you also have a high contrast painting, okay? Contrast can also be your use of shapes. If you have 14 circles and one triangle, then you have contrasting shapes. Okay, so contrast can refer to a lot of things. It can also refer to the light, the lightness and the darkness, the value. You know, we talked about the value was a spectrum, right? So if you took out all those grays and just kind of worked with extreme whites and blacks, then you have high contrast. So here are two examples. The painting down here is a high contrast painting, and this is mostly due to color and light. So we have this very bright, almost, highlighted, like there's a spotlight on her skin tone, and then we have the background directly behind her that is completely pitch black, almost flat black. And together they create high contrast. Then we have a painting up here where every hue is very similar to each other. It's kind of like just these, pinks and lavenders and mauves, and even the other hues in here, like the greens and the violets, right, and the blues, they're still the same value. There's still all these kind of pale and dusty pastel-like colors. And overall, it gives the painting this very kind of, subtleness, that there's not a lot of extreme boldness and, lights and darks, or there's not a lot of extreme opposites going on in that painting. So that is a low contrast painting. Movement. Movement also has multiple references. Movement can refer to the placement of the elements that lead the viewer's eye around an art piece. Okay, so movement can be a way that the artist designs his or her composition purposely to make the viewer travel around the art piece. And so, for example, over here in this corner, by the artist, picking up one mark from the artist, the viewer picking up one mark from the artist, following it, and then, oh look, now there is a shape here and another line to take my eye up this way. And as I travel up this way, look, it intercepts with this new mark. And so this new mark takes me here. And then I've got an interception with another mark that takes me here. And so what's happening is these marks and these compositional arrangements is making the viewer travel around the artwork and look at all of the different areas. Another way that movement is integrated into artwork is that it can wind up giving you a feeling or an impression of motion or energy, and that the painting or the drawing or the sculpture does not feel static, right? Does not feel like it's standing still, but it feels like there's energy and like there's bursts and there's movement. And this painting here called Slave Ship, I think, is a great example because of the way that the artist made their mark, um, and left this kind of deliberate mark making. When you look at this painting, you definitely feel like it's active, okay? Not that it's just kind of flat and sitting still. So that's another way that we can capture and see movement in artwork. The third is kind of the most literal and obvious way, is when the artist is making art and trying to capture an action, trying to capture a motion. It's kind of like the illustrated verb, okay? And this artwork is an example of that. By, the direction of the hot air balloon and the direction of the photographer and the flow of this cloth that's falling out and the uplift of his hat, all of those compositional arrangements is giving the impression that this is something in action, that this is capturing movement. Pattern. Pattern is kind of simple and straightforward. It is a predictable repetition of elements, okay? So predictable meaning, square, circle, triangle, square, circle, triangle, all right? Something that you can expect because it is repeating itself in such an accurate way that you can kind of predict what the next element of art would be. The other thing that's important about pattern is usually a very static repetition, okay? So you're not going to see a lot of movement and you're not going to see a lot of action, that you're really just going to see an organization of elements being lines and shapes, things like that are repeated over and over and over again in a predictable manner. Now, along those same lines, but also having many differences, is rhythm. Rhythm, I think, is a difficult principle for students to pick up in artwork. Rhythm is also about repetition. Repetition of an element, but the difference between rhythm and pattern is rhythm has to capture movement, okay? It cannot be still or static. And rhythm also doesn't have to be extremely predictable and accurate like pattern does, okay? The difference with rhythm is that it becomes a pattern that is dynamic. And because it's a pattern, so a repetition that is dynamic, what you start to feel as a viewer is almost a sense of beat or tempo. And that is exactly why it's coined the term rhythm, okay? That you can almost, see a musical score, musical composition, that it creates some sort of beat when your eye is kind of bouncing around it. Proportion. Um, Proportion is also kind of obvious. It describes how the elements or the subject matters relate to each other in size. But what's important to understand is the artist's intention for when they use proportion, because proportion can be used in order to, achieve accuracy. So, for example, this Roman sculpture down here, proportion, in Greek and Roman times was all about, really trying to capture that like human ratio and that kind of perfection, that, really trying to recreate, human anatomy with accuracy. So you use proportion to help you do that. But also proportion can be completely exaggerated in order to create visual importance in an artwork, or maybe you're using proportion and scale to also convey, depth in artwork, because we know when we looked at foreground, middle ground, and background, right, the tree in the foreground is going to be much, much larger than the mountain in the background, right? Because when we play with those proportions, it helps us understand depth. But it can also just show that there's importance. So we have that depth perspective here in this painting, where we know that the mountains, are off in the distance because they're so small compared to the figure. But the point also is that he is being conveyed as this extremely important person, and therefore he's larger than the mountains, he's larger than life. Okay, so it's giving a message, it's sending a message. Emphasis is how the artist can create a focal point in the artwork, and the and how the artist can, create an area of artwork that catches that viewer's eye. Okay, emphasis can be achieved in many ways. Emphasis can be achieved by placement, and oftentimes, like in this painting, if you place something dead center in your composition, then it's kind of a default that is where the viewer's eye is going to go first. That's kind of a default for creating a focal point. Okay, so placement. You can use contrast to help you create emphasis. So contrast could be, you have mainly black, dark shapes, and then all of a sudden you have one bright yellow spot. Well, of course, your eye is going to gravitate to something that, is a different color or has a different shape or value. And this painting down here called The Swing is a great example of that, where most of the painting are these different hues of greens and grays, and then right here dead center, so you've also got placement, is this bright pink girl on a swing. And so here with emphasis, you actually have two things that are working towards the focal point. You have placement and you have contrast of color. Scale is another way to create emphasis. So this sculpture here of Buddha, you can see the size, the giganticness of it compared to the size of the people that are viewing down below. Okay, so scale. And then there's convergence. Convergence is when you have other elements and principles in the artwork that kind of lead to the focal point, almost as like it were a bunch of arrows saying, right here, the artwork's right here. Convergence is a compositional decision that the artists make. And so this is an example of convergence. Really, this, eagle on a cactus here is the focal point, but not necessarily because of color, maybe scale a little bit, and placement we know, but honestly what is making it the focal point the most is these blue lines that come together and converge right here at the center. And that's bringing our eye to this focal point. All right, unity is when all of the elements that the artist has used together in a work of art create a sense of harmony and make the artwork feel like a cohesive whole. This is a compositional strategy as well, and what it does is it brings all the parts together so that there's a visual connection. And that's this example here by Basquiat. You can see that there's a lot of different areas, right, of things going on. It looks very separated and segregated. You know, you have these bold white lines in between these kind of three panels. You have very separate, almost visual thoughts going on, but yet there's a sense of unity, and that has a lot to do with the artist's style, the artist's line, the artist's color palette, right? So even though there's a lot of different parts, they all come together well, because they all these different parts relate to each other. Okay, so we just went through a bunch of information. We're building upon your knowledge, and we're expanding your understanding of the elements and principles. So let's take a second and test yourself. Looking at this artwork here, can you name two elements and two principles? Okay, now there's more than two elements, there's more than two principles, but can we recognize two of them? And then the important part is, once we recognize them, can we explain it, right? Can we defend it? So take a good look. So in my example, I chose two elements, one being space, because it shows depth, especially this area of the painting where we have this foreground, right? We have the middle ground, which is the edge of the room that he is in, and then we have that background where through the windows and through the doorway we can see there's like an entire city back there. Okay, so there's space and depth, and then I chose value. Lots of value. Look at all this drapery, right? This is showing tons of values. You have a wide array of that grayscale. I also chose unity because, again, there's a lot of parts to this painting, okay? But the artist's style and the elements that the artist is using, the color scheme, all of that is making this artwork a very cohesive whole. I know that they all belong together, and they seem very unified. And then emphasis. You know, we have this bright red dress, we have this bright white. This emphasis tells us that these individuals here in the center are most important. They are also, in terms of placement, the center panel. So there's some obvious emphasis going on. Okay, how about this one? Let's do something architectural. Can we name two elements and two principles in this artwork? Okay, knowing that there's more than two, in my example, I chose monochromatic color. Notice I didn't just say color, okay? It's monochromatic color. It's everything is white. It's one hue. And then I also chose shape because within the structure, we have these beautiful shapes that are quite a focal point within this design. And then for my principles, I chose symmetrical balance. So the Taj Mahal, this is the Taj Mahal, is not just symmetrically balanced, but this is a lovely example of complete mirror image balance. If I were to split this literally right down the middle, the left side would completely and perfectly mirror image the right side. And then I also chose pattern because even though it's a monochromatic color scheme, if you do look closely, the entire facade of the Taj Mahal is covered in elaborate patterns, repetition of shapes and lines, a lot of arabesque patterns because it has that lovely Islamic influence. So I also chose pattern. Okay, that is the end of our slideshow. I know it was a lot. I know it was intense. Hopefully it's given you some clarifications. Hopefully you got some additions to add onto your already structure from your summer homework. Hopefully you added on to that. You will only get better at this. It will only get easier, but this is the language that we will be speaking all year. And so I appreciate you trying your best. Good luck.